Conversations with the Smith Family. I'm Doug Taylor, the CEO of the Smith Family, and in this series we're exploring the big issues that are affecting young people and their futures, and how we can break down the barriers so that all young people have the opportunity to thrive. So today I'm speaking with Kristy Muir. Kristy is the CEO of the Paul Ramsay Foundation. She's a professor at the University of New South Wales and chair of the Allan and Gill Foundation. Now, I first met Kristy about 20 years ago when she was a researcher at the Smith Family and I was working in another role with a different organisation. And since that time, she's led a whole range of social change initiatives across education, employment, housing and mental health, and has led some significant change. And that's what I'm really looking forward to talking with Kristy about today. And we'll talk about leadership and governance work and what it really means to make change that sticks and how we put people at the centre of all the work that we do. So Kristy, education I know is really important for you personally and professionally. Can you tell us a bit about that? And if you can bring it to a moment or experience, that's great. But just a bit about how important that's been for you and your life.
Hi, Doug. Thanks for having me. It's really nice to chat to you as always. Education is super important to me, and I think it is that what's around us shapes us, and where we come from is just so important. And, you know, one of my biggest heroes in my life has been my grandmothers, both of whom didn't have the opportunity to have a decent education. My grandma on my dad's side, she was the smartest kid in school, in primary school, and she was so excited about going to high school. She was one of 8. There was no money, and her thing was always going to be, I will get the scholarship to go to high school because I do really well at school. And the day of the scholarship exams, her appendix burst and they ended her education because there was no money. And, you know, fast forward growing up, I feel so blessed that I got to spend so many hours and hours and hours having kitchen table conversations with her. And, you know, you would go into the house, besides the fact she was a wonderful baker, so it smelled amazing, but you'd go into her house and the broadsheets would be all over the kitchen table. Radio National would be playing on the radio. You know, if and when the TV was on, it was documentaries, and she's probably one of the most well-informed women that I've ever known. And, you know, like super proud to be her granddaughter and to be able to have such fierce conversations with her about social justice, about politics. But to your question about education, you know, she had 5 granddaughters and she was like, my granddaughters will get an education.
Wow.
We all went to public schools. I don't come from a family that would ever have been able to afford a private school education. And there was great value for the public system as well. And so I think, you know, we were all really well educated, and then it came to going to university, and it wasn't even a question of, it wasn't really about what you would study. It was just an expectation of you will all go to university. And so, you know, I think what's remarkable for me about that is, one, like what an amazing kitchen table social justice warrior my grandmother was. And I used to talk to her about, what if you were born in a different generation? What would you have done? And then also realising the gift of education and the fact that how lucky was I to come from a family that valued education and also that, you know, I had an environment around me that could give me the context where I could be well educated.
Yeah. It's such a vivid story. I'm just seeing you at your grandmother's kitchen table. That's so vivid and powerful. And I think the other thing too in that, Kristy, is the broad sense of education. An educated woman engage with the world, engage with ideas, and sometimes, I mean, you and I are both involved in tertiary education. We value it and it's incredibly important. But there's also this life experience that gives us wisdom and knowledge that makes a big difference as well, doesn't it?
Yeah. I really value the formal stuff like you do. Yeah. But to your point, you know, some of my moments of sitting with elders in different First Nations communities and just the deep wisdom. And I think so much of the education in my life and those moments have been, when have I been able to pause and sit and just listen and be curious enough to ask, you know, appropriate questions or or to just be in other people's ether that
Yeah.
have far more wisdom and knowledge than I'll ever have. And then add to that, Doug, that piece around, you and I have spoken about this before, like, how do we always be curious? Because I don't ever want to stop learning.
No,
There's so much we can never know.
Yeah. And asking the right questions matters, just there's so many ways. I could go with what you've said there, Kristy, but I'm just thinking about wisdom, traditional knowledge, and now what we're learning with the advent of AI, of the importance of constructive thinking and asking the right questions. So, and wisdom drives that. It's not just about knowledge, as important that is. So it's kind of coming to the fore. What an interesting time to be in with traditional knowledge and the advent of technology. Now, Kristy, thinking about the great work of the Paul Ramsay Foundation under your leadership, and I know that the purpose here is about ensuring that all people thrive and a big focus on communities having the best chance to take great steps forward. And you've had a particularly strong focus on ensuring that the conditions are right in systems so that people have those opportunities. Tell us a bit about how you're thinking about the particular levers and initiatives that can drive that sort of change in getting those systems functioning at the right level. And I'm wondering if you can put that into an educational context. And there might even be an example that you could use to illustrate what that looks like in practice.
It's such a big question, Doug.
I know,
such a big question. The Paul Ramsay Foundation's how do we help enable people and places to thrive, is something that we deeply believe. And those words are not an accident. I think so much of this in terms of big picture, long-term change is around being clear on what's the purpose and, which people, which places do we most want to work alongside. And part of that as well is how do we contribute to that? So how do we help enable, as opposed to we can't solve any of this by ourselves. And so your question about what are the levers, I think about taking a systems approach, and it's putting the kids, the families at the centre, and then you wrap around the community, the education systems, and I mean systems in all different ways, like we talked about in terms of like my family background, and it's the inherent knowledge that we have around us as well as some of those more formal systems. So how do we think about kids, families, communities, and then what's wrapped around it? What's around us shapes us. And, and this deep belief that actually wherever you are born and wherever you grow up, there is incredible wisdom, there are incredible resources, there are amazing leaders doing incredible things. And there are some conditions that stop people from thriving. And so our kind of strategy, and I guess our flip from silos of work to how do we think about kids, families, communities more broadly, has been from moving from individual focus areas to what if you put the kids at the centre? What does that then look like? Which then moves to what are those levers for change? And I think the other piece to add to that is, so how do we think about the purpose, which people, which places? How do we think about the context, what's actually going on? And it's not going to be the same everywhere. How do we then think about which are the levers for the bits that we want to contribute to? And then it's who are the actors or who are the people and the organisations that actually can best and or are usually already best doing that work, which then means that you're not just looking at multiple levers for change, you're also looking at different people playing different roles, different organisations doing different things. Sometimes they're collaborating, sometimes they're doing those pieces separately. And so I think that's kind of the premise of the strategy. And then how do we constantly learn, adapt, evolve, and work alongside the people that know best. And a lot of our funding in the last couple of years has gone to First Nations-led organisations to do the work because they're closest to it. They have great solutions. And we know when you invest in organisations that are closest to the people they're working alongside, you get better outcomes. So we've funded a whole lot of work in New South Wales, for example, around a strengthening culture, which is all about how do we increase and participation amongst First Nations children and young people in the education system. But it's about cultural identity. It's about engagement. It's about all of the other things that aren't just about what's happening inside the school gate. There's a whole lot of other things outside the school gate that matter in those levers for change. And I know this is close to you and the Smith family's heart. There are so many different levers inside and out the school gates that go beyond the kid being ready to thrive that really matter.
I think in philanthropy, there's such an important catalytic role you can play in bringing people around a common agenda that gets that sort of broader change, because of course we know that's what sustainable change looks like, as opposed to the kind of short-term one-off things. In that context, Kristy, I mean, leadership really matters significantly. I'm wondering if you can just tell us a bit about what you're learning about leadership that works in this sort of context that makes change really stick. And then maybe some of the things where you see people tripping up. Like there's often common things, and I know I experienced that, but with the kind of broader view that you've got, what are your observations about that?
I love leadership as a topic. I love it in terms of what we can always continue to learn. I love it in terms of how we continue to improve, and I think about it in terms of mastery, but in that sense of we never really get there. It's just keep improving.
Lifelong learning.
And so like you, I will always continue to learn and won't always get it right. I think one of my favorite things is to work alongside not-for-profit CEOs or for-purpose CEOs in Social Impact Leadership Australia. And I've also loved teaching and working alongside board directors around how do you govern for social change. So I think this sense of how do you lead for the social progress, and that might be social, cultural, environmental, whatever our kind of purposes and passions are, is different to how do you lead an organisation. And one of the things I wrote about at the start of this year was this leadership balance board, and this notion of as leaders, we are standing on this balance board of course we have fiduciary responsibilities. How do you balance that with the organisation or whatever platform you are currently representing? And then how do we also think about that in terms of where the other balance piece is, which is the purpose work? And I love the leadership question of what if we existed for our purpose and not our organisations? And don't misread me. The balance board, the organisation is part of this. But I think what that enables us to do is to just lift our gaze above the day-to-day work. There's always going to be the day-to-day work that's really important. And actually, when we can start to say, well, what if we exist for the purpose of enabling kids, families, communities to thrive, instead of thinking about we exist for this organisation, all of a sudden I start collaborating differently with you. We start working in a slightly different way, and we have to start to think about what's our role in a system. Not just what's my role. It also, even from a really practical, tangible example, it would give you a different leadership answer if you're thinking about scaling. So often the conversations, and, I've been in boardrooms too and been part of this mess. The conversation is how do we scale the organisation? Not necessarily how do we scale the impact. Which means that the answers are often, we should grow our service. We should move to another state. We should do this. Well, actually, if we think about scaling impact and we think about what if we existed for our purpose, not our orgs, we'd have open source of all sorts of tools, guides, resources. We would start to work in very different ways.
So true, Chris. And, I think about my work with the team at the Smith family, a 103-year organisation, and my kind of commentary to the team is I'm not here to sustain the organisation unless we can sustain impact, because the two have to go together.
So
I'm just thinking your first comment about what's around us shapes us as young people growing up, but equally as leaders. So what we listen to matters, the voices that we preference, the different inputs that we have in our work. So your focus on spending time in community, time I spend with students and families and in schools is really important.
It's such a good point, Doug. And I think that you've reminded me of one of my other favourite questions is how do I hear multiple perspectives? And living that takes intentional work. In terms of which communities do you sit with? Whose voices are we not hearing? What else might be going on here? And if you think about that from an organisational perspective, how do we listen to our people is obviously super important. And what else is going on here that I'm not hearing or seeing, and how do I tap into a whole lot of other perspectives? On the organisational centric things, I think for leaders of for-purpose organisations, because so much of it is driven by something bigger, whether it's about education equity, whether it's about addressing poverty, whether it's about social, environmental, cultural change, love for kids, family, country, whatever the thing is, or multiple things are, I think that actually hearing the perspectives from leaders in other spaces and places can just make us think outside the box.
Yeah.
And then can help us be better leaders in our spaces too.
Yeah, incredibly so. And just kind of building on the divergent voices, kind of stakeholders, actors in the drive to create impact and change, and thinking about how you've described the system and the context in which we work. And I mean, that obviously requires a particular type of leadership that enables collaboration. Tell us a bit about how you've seen that work, and it might be. Can you give us an example of a great collaboration that brought together the right people to create the sort of change?
I love the whole thing about collaboration, and it's that thing about how do we think about what are the right ingredients for collaboration, and to your other point, Doug, how do we make sure that the people we collaborate with are not just the people that we agree with or are in our current ecosystem, but actually what's the most material collaboration for change? It's when you can pick the people that have the most care factor in whatever that issue area is and who have the most influence for that change. And they're not always the people we agree with. And so being able to work across difference, being able to pull together people that we don't necessarily agree with. If you take housing, we have great technical solutions, but actually you got to address not in my backyard. You know, in the education space, you know, you would see this probably still, I imagine, that, you know, there's a whole history of if only you cared about education, it would be fine. You know, and I can almost, in the justice space, be tough on crime. Like, it doesn't matter what the issue is, there is lots of narrative. And it's like, how do we listen to that? How do we listen to that? And what would it look like to collaborate? Because it's pretty rare that you don't find someone who believes that a good education is actually going to be good for everyone. One of the examples that I love is the collaborative group that came together to fund Social Impact Leadership Australia, the leadership program for not-for-profit CEOs, which, you know, I still teach and hold a separate hat to the PRF, even though PRF also funds it. We know the history of like leadership in the not-for-profit sector. It's hard work. It's not funded in the same way as corporate leadership is funded. Not-for-profit leaders, they work really hard. They're deeply passionate and purposeful. They rarely have what we call a culture of permission to invest in professional development. One, because the resources aren't there. It's expensive. When there are resources, often they send their teams to different things. And we also saw massive burnout rates in the sector. All that fast forward to conversations between me and some other funders about what does it actually look like to develop a leadership program for for-purpose CEOs that in the Australian context that has like, you know, that could be globally excellent. And, you know, hats off to a bunch of funders that got together and actually made that happen. And it took probably 3 years.
Right, really.
And part of the commitment to that as funders was that collaboration was all about how do you bring together funders that will fund this for 5 years? How do we be agnostic to who runs it? How do we be agnostic to who is actually going to end up putting money into this thing? Because it's about how do we do this over time, and also how do we commit to something that's going to keep evolving to just be better and fit the needs of the sector. And, you know, fast forward, we're up to the 5th year of running that, and 100 alum. It has an NPS, if anyone cares, of like 92 over those 5 cohorts, which is incredible. But the bit that's amazing to me in terms of this independent evaluation that we've had now sit alongside is that it's actually it's improving leadership from an individual perspective. It's shifting up how organisations are being run. It's building succession planning. It's developing step-up leaders. It's changing the way that organisations are kind of functioning. And importantly, it's having leaders move into systems change.
It's such a great example. And I'm just thinking on 2 fronts about the kind of the multiplying impact of that, Kristy, in terms of I mean, one, the leadership contribution and what that will do, those 100 people and what they do now across organisations and systems at all levels. But then the blueprint you create for funders around collaborating, because, you know, that's a new muscle, I think, being exercised by funders in the philanthropic space.
And it's that thing about how do we have everybody play their role? And it's so naive to think that we can just do this in separate organizations, or
Absolutely.
if I just do this thing, we're going to create change, when actually we know that what's around us shapes us.
Yep.
And that means that how do we engage all of the, all of the different groups with different roles?
Yep.
That means the funders, it means the practitioners, it means people in community, it means that we are working deeply with all sorts of different individual sectors and people that have very different ideologies as well.
Yeah, and working to purpose. And if you think about purpose, kind of, the need, the capability you've got, and the kind of where your passion is and where your energy is as an organisation, and evidence also. There's a lot of license within that. There are still so many choices to think about what you can do with those different actors and what each of those actors can do. And so kind of working and leading purposefully absolutely matters. Kristy, I want to kind of end where we began in a way. And you really generously shared with us a bit about your backstory and how you've been influenced and the role of education. Now, thinking through now to your work today and the really important leadership you provide across a number of different organisations, governance and management, and from a voluntary perspective, kind of what's really sustaining you in this work? Because we've talked about the ups and downs over the years, and there's all those, and the bigger the challenge, the higher the ups, the higher the downs. What kind of really sustains you in this work and fills up your tank and keeps you going?
I have always been driven by this deep sense of purpose. And so that will always be part of what fuels me. And it's not enough. Yeah. It's taken me a lot of years, I think, to get there to that's not enough, because the work isn't always easy. And I love it. And I think one of the things that does sustain me is sitting in community with, whoever it is, whoever's community I'm privileged enough to be in and whoever's lands I'm privileged enough to be on. That is something that gives me great joy and great hope, because it's just incredible people. I think the other thing that, I have learned in more recent years is that we can't serve others unless we serve ourselves. So I am much more gentle on myself than I used to be. I find joy in really simple things in life. Good. Hanging at the park, the morning coffee in bed, being with the dogs. Yes. But I do think that, in a climate of work where from being a very little kid, I've been so driven by being part of, how do we be, I love that, how do we be good ancestors of the future? Yeah. And I will always be so deeply driven by that. How do I hold that with a level of ease that means I can constantly refuel, show up well, and be that good ancestor of the future? And going back to where we started with our grandmothers, I wear 2 of my grandmother's rings, which I'm very lucky enough to have inherited. And one of them is my mum's mum's, and the other grandmother that I didn't talk too much at the start about, she also didn't get a chance of an education. And, one of my greatest memories of growing up with my nana on that side is, they had virtually, there was not money. You'd eat sort of stale bread at dinner, but so much love and such a beautiful family. And one of the great gifts that my nana would gift us was she would basically always have like 20 cents or 50 cents. I'm giving away my age, Doug. And we would walk to the corner shop, which was only like 100 metres away, say, but it would take forever. You would stop at everyone's flower bed. You would talk to all of the neighbours, most of whom were from all different cultures. And the gift of that thing of stop and smell the flowers, the gift of it's okay to pause, the gift of how do I look you in the eye and have a conversation with you and connect with you deeply about whatever it is in life, the sharing of cultures and, whoever's cultural event it was, there was always shared, biscuits or cakes or, whatever the occasion. And so, I think I've been so blessed to have such important, matriarchs in my life that have given me both the drive of, how to be great ancestors of the future. And I've been given an education. I have a responsibility to be a good ancestor, be driven by social change. And how do I hold enough ease and grace to just be and be well? Yeah, love the way you've brought those things together. We've covered a lot of territory today, which has been wonderful. And
In terms of what sustains us, and you've drawn on this, it's, I think it's friendship and working with comrades and colleagues, and we've had our challenges in our work, and that's part of what energizes us, but it is great to have people who are going to walk the road with you. So thanks so much, and thanks for sharing a bit about yourself and these wonderful insights from your work and leadership with people today.
Thank you, Doug, and vice versa. It's a pleasure to be your friend, peer and colleague.
Thank you for joining us for Conversations with the Smith Family. If you'd like to learn more about these conversations or the Smith Family, go to thesmithfamily.com.au.